me talk a little bit about the demand side for religious propaganda, religious imagery, symbols, and ultimately a sales pitch involving some kind of religious meaning. And we have an amazing source. I think one of the best social science research projects ever done is by a sociologist by the name of Theodor Abel, who was wise enough to emigrate from Europe in the 1930s, given that he was Jewish. And he was teaching at Columbia at the time, and he was trying to figure out why people joined the Nazi Party. And he wanted to do what people at the time then did, which was to have in-depth interviews. And perhaps not that surprisingly, they didn't really want to talk to him. People didn't really want to tell him a story about why they joined the Nazi Party. So he had a brilliant idea, which was to put an ad in a Nazi newspaper. And he actually got this cleared, by the way, with a propaganda ministry under Goebbels. And it said, you can win 500 Reichsmarks, which is a fortune, for the best essay on the question, how I became a Nazi. And people said, wow, you know, and nobody suspected anything. It just said, sort of, you know, this is what, yeah, this is the topic, this is the prize, write it to the Schiffer, and then we collect it. So they got 634 submissions. And we have these, they actually sit in Hoover. They've been digitized, and you can go and read the stuff, and they're actually kind of amazing. So now basically all of them, as part of another research project, everything is transcribed. Many people do not tell you what their religion is, which in Germany at the time is already a little bit of a hint, because if you have grown up in Germany, at least certainly up to my generation, one of the principal distinctions between people is, are you Protestant or you Catholic? 99% of the population officially belong to a church. In these statements, a fourth, 2/3 never mention what religion they have. Okay? And then the kind of things they write, I don't know how rusty your German is, if you have any. Yeah. Let me just tell you what it says. This is, for example, one submission by a Frau Agnes Mosler-Sturm from Berlin Spandau. And she talks about what a revelation it is when Hitler became chancellor, that he was the savior of the country. And they had turned to Hitler full of disgust and with holy outrage and fought for his idea. And now that he was chancellor, there was new hope, new faith, new power for the German people, finding its way like an unstoppable stream. And Hitler was the God-given leader of the German people and their savior. Okay? Now, I'm not going to claim that all of these read like that, but there's a significant share that use exactly this language, this imagery, and conceptualize the arrival of the Nazis in strongly religious terms. Okay? So the word holy in the set of 600 submissions, of which at the time we had 300 transcribed, hits 149 times. Faith, with some shades of meanings, is there 380 times in 137 of these autobiographies. Religion, religious, typically in the sense of very intense, very strongly so, is used 70 times. And you have some frequency of mentions of the resurrection of Germany as a result of the Nazis coming to power. So this is sort of the case, narrative case in favor. People are aware of this. It's not as if we're the first people to look at this and nobody's seen it before. The case against says, yes, it's there, but it's not really important. It's just icing on the cake. It's just one of many dimensions of propaganda. Okay? So the political scientists, aware of this, convinced themselves that the concept of political religion is conceptually empty and doesn't really help us understand the rise of the Nazi Party. So Hans Mommsen calls it a form of window dressing. Another prominent scholar thinks that all this religious similarity is just superficial, and it doesn't really have any predictive power. Some people trying to look at evidence argued that the idea that this is this movement is driven by Protestants who've lost their faith is wrong, because you can actually see that smaller cities with higher church attendance have higher Nazi vote shares, and in Protestant enclaves, higher church attendance goes hand in hand with Nazi votes. Okay, but there's no quantitative assessment, it's just comparing some averages. So what do we want to do? We want to think a little bit more broadly about what religion is and to what extent we can seriously claim that there's conceptual similarities, and then take that to the data. Okay? So Emil Durkheim, for example, said a religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, things that set apart the members of the group and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into a single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. There's nothing here about God, as you would expect from a sociologist. He just talks about a set of beliefs and practices. We have certain things that are holy, and this then creates a group that defines itself in contrast and opposition to somebody else. And that's exactly the same thing that the biologist Sloan Wilson in Darwin's Cathedral argues, that religion mainly has a function, and those who think that there's some contradiction between emphasizing forgiveness and then going to war and so forth get it wrong. The main point is to create in-groups and out-groups, and within the in-group there's harmony and cooperation, and outside there's conflict, and the conflict enhances the extent to which you actually have harmony inside. All of these things fit, I think, like hand in glove with what the Nazi Party does, how it conceptualizes itself in opposition to others with certain sacred things relative to practices that you have to adhere to. And if you go to Nora Natsanian's definition of religion, you can also see a lot of similarities. It has to be counterintuitive, Nora Natsanian says, otherwise you don't believe. So the very absurdity of many religious claims, you know, the Immaculate Conception and all that, that's the point. Only if you really profess that you believe in this, can you actually see who is willing to undertake a costly action, something that offends basic logic, and still profess it in front of others. So the idea that a human like Hitler is sent as a savior by divine providence, I would argue, is equally absurd. There's a need for commitment. It's very clear here. People are expected to make costly sacrifices for the German nation. There's communion, rituals that arouse emotions and create a sense of community and community spirit, and compassion, relieving existential anxieties by creating a glorious new Reich, giving meaning to the lives of ordinary party members. So, what have people done? Of course, the rise of the Nazi Party is a not exactly under-researched area. Let me tell you where this fits in, the idea of religion as a determinant of totalitarianism, and then I'll have a word or two to say why I think this is actually an interesting element in political economy itself. Okay, so the first attempts already at the time the Nazis were rising to make sense of this is Marxist. They have a heavy emphasis on big business support. They see the Nazis as agents of monopoly capitalism. And then somehow they convince the petty bourgeois who are at risk of sinking socially to go with the interests of big business. Okay? There used to be a conviction that there's no evidence for any of this. I actually wrote an early paper now, maybe 15 years ago, where we actually show that some of this is true. That the firms that donated a lot of money to the Nazi movement, once they were in power, their stock prices went through the roof. And if you sort of try to back out who must have had a connection that people at the time saw, but that we can't document perfectly, there's actually a lot of people that must have gotten into bed with the Nazis before 1933. Otherwise, we cannot explain the extent to which their stock prices explode after January 30th. Okay? What most political scientists now would say is that this Marxist interpretation is maybe something at the margin, but the Nazis act as a catch-all party of discontent. So not everybody really believes most of what the Nazis profess to believe. It's mostly about being against something that the Nazis dislike, like the Weimar Republic. It's not so much being in favor of a particular structured program of ideas, policies, preferences. Okay? And as part of this discourse, you have discussions about why does democracy arrive so late in Germany? Why doesn't Germany have a successful revolution in the 19th century like other countries? So maybe this unfinished modernization in German society with this semi-democratic regime up to 1918, maybe this is what's being resolved through the move to Nazism. There's totalitarianism theory that emphasizes that basically fascism and communism are just two expressions of the same thing, and one reacts against the other. It has a lot of overtones or echoes of the early Marxist analysis, and it emphasizes the fact that the people who find much of this ideology most appealing have moved to the cities. She left the rural, small-scale communities and environments in which they traditionally lived and are now basically rootless, subject to the siren song of totalitarian ideology from the communist side and the fascist side. And I would think that the literature to which we contribute, the approach that we try to implement here, is an extension of this totalitarianism theory as pioneered by Hannah Arendt, Ortega y Gasset, Nolte, that emphasizes the role of religion as part of the value proposition of the Nazis. There's something different about them not just being chauvinist, meaning militarist and in favor of a rematch with France, heavily against the socialists and communists, but that there's an extra dimension here with this view that joining the Nazi party actually does something that transcends a simple utilitarian calculus. I see Josh Rouse raised his hand. Let me just say one more thing, how I see this positioned in political economy, in economics, and then I'm happy to take the question. So political economy is a pretty vibrant field in economics, and we brought basically sort of utility maximizing rationality into analyzing politics. And I think that has made enormous contributions. But somewhat paradoxically, we used to think of politics as this arena where utility maximization, rationality, etc. didn't have much to say. We bring in from economics and public choice and so forth this different metric and logic. And in some ways, in political economy, we've missed the behavioralist revolution. The realization that people aren't always rational, that they have needs other than sort of being fed and housed and making money. All of that we've applied to every single walk of life that economics cares about, from the marriage market to job markets to how you spend your free time. In political economy, a behavioralist twist is almost entirely conspicuously absent. So if you think about what actually getting into power means for the Nazi party, right? These guys have 2.6% of the vote in 1928. By 1933, in what is a pretty fair election, 44% of the electorate say, yes, this is what we want. And they know that this is the last election. So it's like, if you view this through the lens of standard utility maximizing political economy, this is like turkeys voting for Thanksgiving, right? You're not going to be asked again. Democracy, we conceptualize as a commitment to future redistribution. That's why elites democratize. And here the people say, no, we don't want this stuff. Thank you. We want something else, but we're not going to be asked anymore. How do you make sense of that? Well, maybe it's not about utility maximization. Josh, you're on.
Thanks very much, Joachim. I'm sorry I'm not in the room, but I am following along eagerly here, and it's a fascinating presentation so far, and a thesis that I think it clearly has a lot of empirical backing. I had a question for you about some of these existing approaches and also how they tie into your approach. So ultimately, the Nazis engaged in a lot of expropriation, particularly of Jews, of successful Jews who own businesses and so on. And I don't know how much of a part of their platform earlier on that coming expropriation was. But one thing that strikes me that I've always thought is that one of the appeals to people potentially of voting for the Nazi Party would be that some of that the benefits of that expropriation, if it was foreseen, would accrue to them. And as I think about the correlation between that potentially and religiosity, maybe more religious people are less likely to think that it's a good idea to to just expropriate your neighbor's property by force, since such an idea is actually antithetical to the Judeo-Christian tradition and to the Bible. So wondering whether that theory, maybe the political scientists may have grappled with that a lot and decided it's not that relevant, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
That's a great point to bring up, and this would be like the exact logical opposite, right? Then people basically are sort of voting in their own interest because they want their neighbor's property, and here's a party that now makes it feasible, desirable to go and get it. I see the logic, but I don't think that this is a motivating factor for the following two main reasons. The first one is that, contrary to what some people think and what Hollywood makes you believe, the number of Jews in Germany in 1933 is really quite low. So there's probably 0.6, 0.8% of the German population that's Jewish. And they are disproportionately successful. So a surprising number of them are CEOs and professors, judges, doctors and lawyers. That's true, but 2% even wouldn't move the needle, right? But it's much less than that. So, and the second thing is that the Nazis never actually argue that this is what they're going to do, that they're actually going to expropriate people and redistribute. What they do say is that they think that there's a conspiracy between the Democrats, the bad guys, the socialists, and the communists, right? Communism is just a form of a Jewish conspiracy, and the Republic, the hated Republic, that came into being as a result of the defeat in 1918, is run by Jews for the benefit of Jews, and once they are in power, they will reduce this influence. That's the value proposition that they run on. And that this might be better for people in material terms is certainly part of the package, but it doesn't come from redistribution. David Henderson, go on.
Yes, I have a question, and sorry, I had a dental appointment, so I missed the first 15 or 20 minutes. So you might have covered this, but what I read William Shirer's book back in the 60s when it was a big deal. Yep. And what I've read since then is that one of the huge things he missed was that Nazism was a youth movement. Do you talk about that, or did you talk about it and I missed it, or what's your thought on that?
Okay, no, that's a great point, and with apologies to those who didn't miss the first couple of minutes, let me just remind you or share with you the official song of the Hitler Youth. Yeah. Which goes on and on about how they're anti-Christian, they don't need God because they have Hitler, and all the gatherings are on Sunday morning. So especially amongst the people who are easier to indoctrinate, who don't really have strong connections to one particular set of beliefs, this is a message that they certainly push. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're going to provide the empirical evidence?
I'm going to talk about empirical evidence.
Yeah, because I'm worried you're going to run out of time.
No, we have time, no? Yeah. The very next slide is called analytical approach. Yes. So please.
Just on the previous slide, actually.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that definition of religion is very broad.
Yeah.
It will include things like CrossFit people, powerlifters, fandoms, right? All of them have these four kind of things. They're very expensive to get to know. But they're not exclusive. You can be both a CrossFitter and powerlifter. You can be a fandom of different fandoms. I thought that your argument will require that religions be exclusive of each other,
Yes.
so that you get the thing that you need.
But that is, of course, an essential feature of religion. You can't be Christian and Muslim at the same time. You can't be a fascist and a communist
This is not on the list.
at the same moment.
Yeah, this is not on the list.
No, I think you're right, but we're trying to sort of take other people's definitions and then say, how does this fit? I totally agree that they're missing something that's important, and that, again, strengthens the analogy. Okay, before people get more nervous, I'm going to try to convince you that we will finish on time and you will see the evidence. So what do we want to argue and how we're going to show it? We think that fascism is an important part of its appeal is that it's a pseudo-religion. So how can you make this point? And the whole idea of the paper is to say, within Germany, some people are much more Christian than others. And we'll talk about the reasons for that, and we'll try to find exogenous variation in the extent to which they actually are more Christian than others. And what I'm first going to show you is that the OLS, cross-sectional pattern, is such that support for the Nazi party, as measured by Nazi vote share or by Nazi party entry, is positively correlated with how shallow religiosity is in the 1930s. First thing I'm going to do is to show you how we measure that. And then I look at some deep historical roots that we think are plausibly excludable, that change the extent to which religiosity, Christianity is shallow. Why do we talk about shallow Christianity? We sort of made up this concept. Everybody is nominally Christian. There's nobody here who's not registered with a church. There's some people who are official non-believers, but they're a tiny percentage of the population, less than 2% of the country as a whole. We're going to have to talk about what controls to use. You can use Protestantism, but we think it's a bad control. Okay? All right, so why do we think that some parts of Germany show what we think of as shallow Christianity? This is how Christianity spreads in Europe, and it spreads from the 5th century, 6th century on until the 13th century. So there's some parts of Germany where Christianity already arrives during the Roman Empire. During the Roman Empire, it's a grassroots movement emphasizing voluntary decisions, communion, and that converts people to Christianity. These are the earliest parts. And then, so it's from the 3rd century onwards that you have this. The last parts that get converted, that's Eastern Prussia. Christianity arrives in the 13th century, and it arrives in a very different form. It arrives as a result of top-down Christianization. It's the kings and princes that convert and then impose their religious choice on their populations against their will, most of the time. And you have case after case where the pagan population rises up, kills the bishop, and then the king has to send in the troops and make sure that people at least don't burn down the churches. So there's like 1,000 years of difference between the Rhineland, where Christianity arrives in the 3rd century, and Eastern Prussia, where Christianity arrives in the 13th century. And the extent to which you have pagan practices persisting in these areas where Christianity arrives late is totally amazing. One of the things I'm going to talk about in a second is there's a German folklore atlas that they collect in the 1920s and 1930s. And in many parts of Pomerania and in Prussia, for example, you have continued use of these ancient pagan burial practices. There are places in Germany in the 1920s where burial means that you hack off the head of the dead and you bury it between the legs of the deceased. Okay? That's not a very Christian thing, but the Vikings did this. Okay? And this continues into the 20s, and the anthropologists document it. Now, this is so extreme and so weird that we're just going to have one spot on the map that does this. We're going to use something else to measure variation that's a little bit less extreme in how pagan beliefs are. Okay? So this point that there's a big difference in the way Christianization proceeded is made by many people. Some extreme statements here by Greeley, for example, said Christian Europe never existed. There was There can be no de-Christianization because Christianity was always minimal. What most people in this literature believe is that there's this highly subsidized state church, and their grassroots Christianity remains weak. Where you spread Christianity through the baptism of kings, it becomes a monopoly franchise, and it basically doesn't sell. It's only where it's sort of a mass movement in the early years of Christianity that people really believe. Okay? So there's a little bit of empirical evidence comparing different European countries, nothing that would necessarily convince us, but the broad patterns are that the same number of centuries since Christianization is highly correlated with church attendance. It's highly correlated with how many Catholics you have. So what this is going to do is it's going to create extra variation that says even within the Protestant and the Catholic part of Germany, Christianity itself arrived at different points in time. And this, we have strong reasons to think, actually creates differences in the extent to which people firmly believe in the Christian doctrine. We're going to measure shallow Christianity in 3 ways. The first one is name religiosity. And we're not the first people to think of names as a good indicator of what your parents think is right and wrong and what they believe in. And we basically say, what is the percentage of people that have a religious name, where religious name is proxied by the name on a church? And we look at the relative frequencies. And if your name is only ever on a church, you're going to have a score of 1. And if your name is never on a church, then you're going to have a score of 0. Okay? The second one is this German folklore atlas that I just mentioned. We're not going to take the hacking off of heads and burial practices because it's not common enough. But they ask lots and lots of questions. Many of them are very boring. One that we think is actually very useful is, do you believe in seers? Are there people who can actually predict the future, see the future, and then people come and consult them, right? So is there actually a belief in clairvoyance, which is clearly not something that is compatible with standard Christian religious doctrine. And the last thing we do is we actually collect data on notables, people who become famous in a modest way, meaning, make it to a doctor, lawyer, bishop, professor, and so forth. And we look at the local level how many of them who die between 1900 and 1930 have a religious profession. And these 3 things we're going to throw together. So name religiosity looks like this. Yellow is no religious names, and dark blue is very high number of religious names. Please.
So there's this notion that, whether you have 700-year roots or 1400-year roots is very important, seems very counterintuitive to me. You're getting geographical variation from that, but my first thought would be that there are many other things that might be correlated with this geographical variation that would strike me as more important. Economic development, urbanization, what are the primary industries, proximity to other countries. How well can you
we're gonna
control for all these things?
We're gonna throw in a lot of controls, and we're gonna have, I hope, something that you're willing to buy as an instrument that helps us understand at a very local level variation here. And I don't think it's just 700 years extra. It's actually up to 1,000 years difference. But the important thing too is how it spreads. If it's imposed top down, it never becomes something that people believe. If it's part of a grassroots movement in the Rhineland, people have been believing for almost 2,000 years. You got a point?
I'm just curious, like with the names on churches, like whether it's possible maybe to fix up something else. Like I'm curious, like why you wouldn't just use something as simple as like names of famous saints, Matthew and Teresa versus Thor, for example. Like, and maybe the Arnott thing loads a lot on that, but I feel like, I don't know, maybe just names on churches might be names of people that are giving money, and then you have income and. This
is not 20th century America. So there's no Karstadt church or Thyssen church. So German churches are called sort of Martinskirche. Sebastianskirche. So they're basically all biblical names, all named after holy people from the Bible. It's a standard measure in this literature to take this. The pagan names that you mentioned, yeah, nobody's called Thor. Adolf is a pagan name. You can play a little bit with that. It didn't seem to give us much empirical traction. So we just went with what's standard, not reinvent the wheel too much. We can certainly do it differently. Let me show you what clairvoyance looks like. There's a pretty strong north-south gradient here in terms of people who believe that you can foresee the future, and there's local people in the community that actually consult seers. And then the share of religious notables, the data is not super rich, but there's clear geographical variations, and there's a much higher share of people who actually reach positions of power that are actually doing through the church positions. Please.
So, okay, because I wouldn't understand. So I'm a doctor and I'm also a deacon in the church. That's what you mean in religious notable?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. So if you're just a doctor, you're a 0, and if you're also a deacon in the church, you're a 1.
Okay.
If you make it a bishop, you're a 1. If
A
you make it a
bishop is
rector,
not-
you're a 0.
You can be a bishop and still be a doctor at the same time?
No, bishop is a full-time job.
It has to be something like deacon.
David Henderson. Click here to allow people to speak.
Sorry. Yeah. One thing I noticed, and maybe this just shows that I don't know German geography, but in your first picture of Germany there, you had a whole concentration of Christians in Bavaria, which is, I thought, where the Germans were. Oops, I'm going to skip that. Where the Nazis were strong, and then the other. I'm sorry, someone wants to reach me. Sorry. So that's the first thing, and then the second thing. I don't know exactly where Berlin is, but it seems to me Berlin is where Christianity is fairly weak. One second, I got it. I'll call you later. Where Christianity is fairly weak, and so I know they hated Hitler in Berlin by and large, and so I just don't get it.
Yeah, no, I think those are, of course, important observations. The way we're going to do our empirics is once the Nazis are actually a national party, competing nationally, no longer sort of relying on regional origins, which are in Bavaria. And then, it's a matter of what does the data actually say? What do we get in a cross-section of 1,000 counties and not casual empiricism of Berlin versus Bavaria?
Okay.
Right? That's the whole idea, that we actually take this to large amounts of data as much as we can get. And here you're getting a flavor of that. So these are not plotting every data point, but bin scatters, where we put them together in bins to make the pattern more visible. And this is what we argue we can do. We can actually create this measure of shallow Christianity from these 3 components. And you can see how much they correlate with each other. So in places where the name religiosity is weak, people are much more likely to believe in clairvoyance. Where you have few religious notables, people are more likely to believe in clairvoyance. Where name religiosity is high, you have fewer religious, you have more religious notables. So we extract all of this with principal components, and then I'm going to use this, what we call shallow Christianity. There's a smell test that we can apply if it's a source that we love, but it's not available to cover all of Germany. We actually go to gravestones and look at the headstones in graveyards. Not our idea, it's been done by Zielinski before. But the basic idea is that if you have the second item here on your headstone instead of the first, maybe you're just a little bit less religious, okay? So we code this up for a total of 400,000 graves. And then you get the share of Christian symbols on gravestones. And as David Henderson just said, yeah, Bavaria is a very religious place. The areas where Christian symbols are basically conspicuous by their absence already in the first half of the 19th century, all the way up to 1930. So if we actually correlate this with shallow Christianity, we get a coefficient, we get it with all the components in the right way, and it's correlated with a Nazi vote share. So we think we're onto something. There's something underlying these geographic patterns that expresses itself in several dimensions, and it passes the smell test. So let's get to the heart of the matter. Left-hand side, our measure of shallow Christianity, the principal component we pull out from the three variables where we have countrywide coverage. Right-hand side is the Nazi vote share in 1933. You can see a broad pattern of association, north-south, east-west gradient, and then some local variation that seems to coincide, but it's really an empirical question if this is strong or not. Okay, so here's some bin scatters for vote shares in different elections, not just 1933 that you saw a second ago. If you do 1928, you don't get much, and we think this is mainly a result of the Nazis being a small marginal party of protest, terribly unknown, still tainted by the scandal of the beer hall putsch. By 1930, you see the pattern, and it basically stays constant across elections all the way up to 1933. And in the lower right-hand side corner here, this is party entry. This is people joining the party, which in some ways is sort of the costliest decision you can make, because prior to 1933, you might lose your job as a civil servant, there's ostracism, there's all sorts of bad things that might happen to you if you join the party because it's very visible. Okay, if you do OLS, you actually run it, we have a total of 800 observations. It's very strongly correlated, okay? And you can do this with no controls, and then we sub down to all these problems with, am I comparing East Prussia just with the Catholic Rhineland, or I can do lots of controls, industrial structure, population shares, proxies for educational level, and province fixed effects. And even within that, I basically get the same results. The coefficient barely changes, sometimes it strengthens. The total R squared goes up, but it doesn't really affect the coefficient on shallow Christianity. Please.
How is Protestantism playing into this? I mean, you've alluded to you're going to get to this, but I mean, it looks to me, from what I know of German geography, that shallow Christianity is very correlated with heavily Lutheran and Protestant areas, where there's a very different social structure of religion than there is in the Catholic Church, and there's also different ideology associated with it and things like that. And and that's what the literature says, right? Is that
it is what the literature says, and one of the motivations for the paper is that, like, the big stylized fact is that the single most important predictor for Nazi voting is whether your county is Protestant or Catholic, right? So you're basically one or the other. There's no places with 50-50. It's either 90% this or 90% that, but that has the biggest predictive power, nothing socioeconomic, and so on. And that people have taken as an answer. And Sasha and I thought, that's not an answer, that's a question. Why would that be? What is it about Protestantism? And the answer we're trying to show you, and I'll show you the evidence that controlling for Protestantism does not make this go away, is that it's not that the Protestants necessarily fall for the Nazi message. On average, the Protestants are much less committed to religion as such. They're the ones who are shallow in their religious beliefs. They're the ones who lost God in the 19th century, whereas the Catholics all still believe. That's the message. That's why we think there's cleavage is there. It's nothing to do with Protestantism. It's nothing specific to Catholicism. But because you brought it up, I'm just going to do what I normally never do, which is to skip ahead and actually show you how much of a difference it makes. Here in table 2, at the bottom, we control for Protestantism. Okay, so it does have an effect on some of our results, but from 1932 onwards, you actually continue to get significant coefficients. For party entry, you get it in 1933. You get it for the November, July, and for the second presidential elections. The coefficients are all positive except for 1928, but you lose some significance in terms of
And the
standard area.
coefficients are a small fraction of what they were without the control.
The coefficients are smaller. And
Much smaller.
the reason, but we think that Protestantism is a bad control. Why? Because Protestantism spreads in those areas where we have a lot of shallow Christianity. This is exactly your point. You said the Protestants are where you actually have a lot of shallow Christianity. If that is true, and people partly opt for Protestantism because they were never with the Catholic message that much, then just throwing in Protestantism is basically going to be over-controlling for something. It's a bad control in that sense. It's a confused control. Okay, lots of questions now, please.
So I'm totally on board on your thesis, but here's where I'm a bit worried, and that is, you have in mind this idea that these people didn't have a very strong religion, and the Nazis came around and provided them with a strong religion. But why did it take 1,000 years or 500 years?
Okay, so our story would be that, until the 19th century, this is a state religion. Protestantism is a state religion. There's no religious competition. There's no free entry. If you're in, say, Protestant areas, this is the one thing that you have to do, and your local lord will make sure that you attend church no matter what you believe, right? It's only by the late 19th century, once people moved to the cities and they're actually exposed to different religious options, also different types of thinking, that you can actually express what your outlook on life is. That would be my story. Please.
I'm curious. I broadly sort of agree with the thesis in general, but I'm just curious, like, what do you think about what the Catholic Church is saying about Nazism during this period, and to what degree the church, or the Catholic Church is saying about maybe to vote or not to, or how to think about Nazism. I'm curious how you think about that may be weighing on, like, if you think about shallow Christianity, it's really just Protestantism and.
Yeah, so the religion with both churches is complicated at the time. At the aggregate level, sort of at the top level, there's no support and there's no real opposition. Okay, and once you have the official agreement between the Nazi government and the Catholic Church, the Concordat in 1934, they're actually quite close, and the Catholic Church almost never opposes anything the Nazi government does. Prior to that, you have some Protestant areas where some priests go Nazi all the way. Brown priests and Tillman and Spenko have actually worked on this, and they show that this actually seems to move the needle too. But we don't think that the church itself is the important mechanism. We think that it's some people who have religious desires, needs, preferences that are unmet that then make them more susceptible to the Nazi message. Please.
Do we have enough data to actually separate Protestants from Catholics and just run shallow Christianity within those two sets? Because that will get rid of the problem that Ken brought up of, is the difference between them. If you can find shallow Christianity between both.
Let me show you one thing that I think speaks exactly to this. It's a standard variable in this literature is to look at the distance to Wittenberg, where Luther first showed his theses. And in the areas close to Wittenberg, we know that Protestantism spread with huge success rates, like 94% of the population is Protestant. So we take this section of Germany, panel A, and you can see how there's a very strong positive correlation between the Nazi vote share on the y-axis and shallow Christianity on the x-axis. And it's pretty much the same slope that you have if you go further away than 250 kilometers, looking at the rest of Germany. Except that, now the overall distribution of shallow Christianity is shifted, and the overall distribution of Nazi votes is shifted too. And you actually have even shallower Christianity in some parts, as you would expect it with a bigger sample. You have especially lower levels of shallow Christianity, meaning more committed Christians in those areas further away, where you actually come into Catholic pockets. Frank has raised his hand, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have statistics on participation. I don't know if it would be party membership and profession. Because perhaps academics would be more secular, and seemed like they didn't behave well during this period.
Yep.
As far as Nazi membership goes.
Yep, no, that's a good point. I've worked with the Nazi membership records. You do get data on occupations. To be perfectly honest, this I think is one of the great scandals in German post-war record keeping in history. There used to be easy access to those files. The Americans captured most of the Nazi membership records. They transferred it at some point to the Germans, who set up a separate document center, and then access was easy. And at some point it was wrapped into the German Federal Archives. And I don't know whether it's through incompetence or deliberately, but they did a digitization project, which is so bad that now it's vastly less easy to access these cards than it would have been 20 years ago. Because they have it on computers, there's just 5 of them, you cannot really, so, you know, at some point I actually wanted to do a big sample thing because everybody's sort of putzing around with 30, 40,000, which doesn't give you anything at the geographical level. We have some stuff that we can use here, but there's just not enough to have a plethora of controls, because despite the fact that all the stuff is sitting there and you could digitize it if you do it right in a year, the access just isn't there.
I had read somewhere that the Einsatzgruppen, which I guess, you know, did the mechanized killing unit for Jews, was comprised of a lot of professionals. So they must have some data on SS professions. Yes. And I imagine some of the better educated were actually, you know, pretty brutal in this period. So that might be one way to check.
Yes, no, I think that's a super fascinating additional dimension, right? Because we tend to think that education makes people better humans. The civilizing influence of education and all these Enlightenment ideas. And you know, that's certainly not the pattern that we see following the 7th of October. And we certainly don't see it in the interwar period, where exactly as you say, the first large social organizations in Germany that go all Nazi are the student organizations. The students start to have a majority for the Nazis long before they're even anywhere at the national political scale. Ivan, you had a point.
Yeah, so I read somewhere that the entire resistance movement against the Nazi was actually deeply religious, right? As was the constitution they drafted, the leaders, yep. And most of the members were Catholic. Is that, you know, something?
Yes, that's certainly true, and we should actually maybe bring that in. It's more at the anecdotal level because the numbers aren't huge, but the number of people who are strongly religious in the resistance movement is certainly high. You do have a second group that's completely a-religious, which is the communists. It's both groups that push back, but about half of the people who seriously oppose and then get all killed have a strong religious set of beliefs. Okay, let me just show you what happens if you throw in other explanatory variables. I've been playing in this space for a while, so it's very natural to say, what about those other explanations that you tried to sell us last week? Does your shallow Christianity thing survive any of the other used cars you've been hawking for the last couple of years? So first line here is the coefficients we get for the different elections on shallow Christianity. This is, again, just the basic bivariate pattern. I have some work showing that places that have a deep history of anti-Semitism going back to pogroms during the Black Death, they're more anti-Semitic in the interwar period, including stronger Nazi voting. What you see here is the coefficient on shallow Christianity. If I add this extra control that you see in line 2, pogroms, nothing much changes. Any kind of pogrom, nothing much changes. Direct exposure, it's one of these stories that the Nazis do seize on. There's a bank that collapses, it's led by a Jew. It doesn't really change the coefficient very much. And then some other work in which we look at the number of associations per capita, and we argue that with Nico Voigtland and Shanka Satirnath, that this helps to really spread the message. And adding that in, if anything, increases the predictive power of what we do. Okay, let me talk about identification. right? Because these are just associational patterns with some controls that you may believe or not believe, and especially in the case of Protestantism, it's really problematic to just throw it in. So what are we going to do? I'm going to try to tell you that we can identify something that's plausibly exogenous, that changes how shallow Christianity is in Germany in the 1930s by looking at exactly these patterns that we talked about earlier. How does Christianity spread? And we're going to look at two variables: the distance to a site of pagan worship in the Middle Ages and the distance to medieval monasteries. And as long as you believe that the distance to a site of pagan worship itself does not make you a Nazi voter, but it plausibly changes how Christian people in your location are, we have an instrument that we can work with. So what is this data? Take a concrete example. There's the so-called sacrifice bog in Vogtei, Thuringia. It's 200 meters from the village of Oberdorla. It's a supra-regional cult because we find objects from all over Germany. It operates for 1,000 years, from 600 BC to 500 AD, long before Julius Caesar invades Germany, long after the almost at the collapse of the Romans. It's one of the largest Iron Age cult sites in Europe. We find lots of wooden figurines dedicated to the gods and so forth. We find remains of cattle and sheep that have been sacrificed, as well as human remains. Probably, according to anthropologists, signs of human sacrifice. So we collect all this data on sites of pagan worship. We geolocate 300 of them and calculate distances. This is what they look like, okay? Very rich set of observations. Some of them are just places of gathering, Heidenhöhlen, this is where the pagans gathered. Others are these cult sites or places of sacrifice. Distance to monasteries is kind of straightforward. We know where the monasteries are. They follow a certain economic logic where they actually are built because they need to be economically self-sustaining. We create these two variables and then throw them in, and I'm going to show you that they work. Upper left corner here is distance to pagan sites and how shallow is Christianity. The further away you are from a pagan site, the less shallow Christianity you have, meaning the stronger the attachment to the church or religious expression in one form or another. If you look below, distance to monasteries, far away from monasteries means more shallowness, less attachment to religiosity. And then the Nazi party outcomes is like the reduced form. That already works. Distance to pagan sites, far away from a pagan site means less Nazi voting. Far away from a pagan site means less party entry. If you're far away from a monastery, on the other hand, you vote more for the Nazis. And if you're far away from a monastery, you're also more likely to join the party. Now I'm going to show you the same thing with statistics. The reduced form is what you see at the top. Here we just run Nazi party voting and entry against distance to medieval monasteries and the distance to pagan places. The coefficients are from 1930 onwards, what you expect. Statistical significance seems to be there. And then we do the basic specification where we just instrument and have in the regression shallow Christianity, which my econometrics friends tell me is the best way to do this. We don't have a weak instrument problem, so this Anderson-Rubin statistic and the Fs all look good. F's around 30, everything else is below 1%. And then you can throw in a lot of controls and basically results stay the same or get stronger. And this is the strongest claim that I think we have in the cross-sectional data that this is really causal. I cannot think of a good reason why distance to paganism makes you a Nazi, except that it influences how religious you are. And why that persists, there's an easy institutional story to tell. Now, let me tell you about some additional evidence. Sorry.
And the whole link between paganism and Nazism, I think, like, getting back to the title of the paper, Death of God, I mean, Nietzsche, loves the pagans and all the pagan thinkers.
And the Nazis love Nietzsche.
Right, exactly.
So I
You've
guess,
already sold. That's good. I like that. But I still think that it's valuable to have data that shows the patterns.
Okay, it's very reticent today. I mean, this is what we're facing, the death of religion today.
Yes, absolutely. I think, if you sort of zoom out, we're running a social experiment that's completely unprecedented, where, almost all the developed world is completely irreligious, and all the traditional ties between people have been severed. And it wasn't much of a problem as long as people continued to do what they always do. But now we have social media, we have educated suddenly half of the population at the college level when it was less than 5% a generation ago. And how this is going to end is a very interesting question.
Well, I mean, the problem is Donald Trump looks a lot like this.
I've written some blog posts on the similarities and the differences. This is, I'm with you, but only part of the way. Okay, let me tell you, because we don't have infinite time, a little bit about one source of data that I think might address some of these concerns of, yes, you're still comparing Prussia with the Rhineland and, okay, pagan sites, maybe. I think I have something we think of as very compelling, where at the individual level, I'm going to show you that the people who come from families where parents gave their children religious names, which normally means that they're more religious, are more likely to join the Nazi party. Controlling for the naming patterns at the local level. Okay?
Less likely.
So, sorry?
I thought religious names meant you were less likely to join the party.
Sorry, that's what I meant. Yes. So, what we're going to do is at the local level, we look at these naming patterns, and then we collect the data that we have on Nazi party members and their names. Plus, we use an extra dictionary of Nazi leaders, das Führerlexikon des Deutschen Reiches, where you have entries like this chap here on the left, who's the head judge of an important court in Breslau. And we collect for all these locations the people who are leaders of the New Germany, leading Nazis in 1934. Here's the share of Christian names in these different groups. So for comparison here, you have the theology students, share of Christian names, about 55%. If you go to the population as a whole, we derive it from the people who died in World War I. It's about 20%. Amongst Nazi members, there's a distribution, but it's very low. And the people in leadership positions, it's even less. If you do this intensive margin, how religious is the name, you get basically exactly the same pattern. So this I think of as modestly strong evidence. Here on the x-axis, you have the share of Christian first names in a location that we derive from this cross-section of names in World War I. People die in World War I or become injured. That gives us the local level, and then the share of first names that are Christian, we plotted here for Nazi party members, white dots, and for the people in the Führerlexikon, the leaders of the Nazi movement at the time. The red line would be the 45-degree line, so if they just follow what the population does, that's what you would expect. And what you see is that the Nazi party members themselves are already much less likely in each location to actually have a Christian name. So if I go to a town and they have 30% on average Christian first names, then the Nazi party members are going to have less than 20. Okay? If I look at the leaders, it's even less. It's going to be 10%. Okay? And it doesn't move at all with what the location does. It's very low. So this, we think, helps us get rid of a lot of unobservables and possible sources of confusion. And the fact that at the individual level, people sought into the Nazi party membership, which is a very costly signal. You pay a high price for joining the Nazis before 1933. I think is a strong evidence that patterns here point to shallow Christianity driving some of the appeal of the Nazi party. Please.
I know you don't like this variable, but how much of this is just Protestant versus Catholic?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing, because the location here, every single location, basically to 95 out of 100 is either Catholic or Protestant. So every single location here, any dot is either Catholic or Protestant, and all the variation here comes from what happens within this place. And in that place that's either Catholic or Protestant, the Nazi Party members don't have religious names. Everybody else may do so.
Now, do you have people in a location, you say the location is, say, Catholic, are there people who are actually de facto Protestant, but they're
No.
attending Catholic
No.
church and stuff like that, because that's what you have to do in the location?
No, it doesn't happen.
Okay.
No. There's it's one of the things that people don't know, but it's actually really striking. And at least in my generation, this used to be a huge thing. In areas of mixed settlement, you'd know that that village is Catholic and this village is Protestant, and they might be, 4 kilometers apart or something. But this would be a big thing, partly because the schools would be Catholic and Protestant and so forth. But there's no clandestine Protestants. There's no crypto Christians here. Okay. Let me show you a little bit of a teaser. So the question always comes, is it just specific to Germany? Is it just some kind of weird thing about this one country where everything is a bit strange? So we actually said, well, there's another country that also goes fascist, and goes fascist not by force of guns as Spain, but through the voting mechanism up to a point. So we just did the same thing for Italy. We look at the fascist vote share, we collect name religiosity, just like in Germany, from the people who died in World War I. And you see in 1924, in 1921, the more religion you have, the lower the fascist vote share is. The fewer fascist murders you get, the less fascist violence. It does seem to weakly correlate with the number of fascist party members in 1919, so that's the variable that doesn't quite fit. This is for 4,000 municipalities. The thing that we want to do next is the same thing at the local level that we did in terms of leaders, party members, and then properly control, and just see if the same patterns overall hold. Okay, let me wrap up here. So, because you're a very attentive audience, you stole some of my thunder. This quote by Nietzsche, of course, the favorite philosopher of many Nazis, not entirely accidental, God is dead. What are the political consequences? And the theologian and writer C.S. Lewis famously in 1943 said, where men are forbidden to honor a king, they honor millionaires or gangsters. For spiritual nature, like bodily nature, will be served. Deny it food, and it will gobble poison. And that's what we think the interpretation is. There's just a need for certain things, and if it's not satisfied one way, you will find another way to satisfy it. What we show in our data is new evidence on an old idea that the Nazi movement itself is misconceptualized as a mainly political movement. It is mainly a political religion. It heavily punts on the use of religious imagery, religious symbols, and its appeal is greater in those places where Christianity has not vaccinated the population by instilling deeply held religious beliefs. And these are the people who fall for the siren song of a totalitarian movement. And it's intimately linked with the concept of charisma. Charisma is a religious concept. And the first thing that everybody who's heard Hitler speak talks about is his charisma, which is the idea that there's this magic thing that happens with an audience as somebody speaks in a belief in extraordinary powers. And this is what seems to underlie the appeal, that this is something that works more strongly on some people than others, and especially those who have actually not had the benefit of deep religiosity imbibed from childhood days. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So why have we not applied the theory to the Soviet Union? Is it just because you don't have the data?
So how would you do it in the Soviet Union?
Well, that clearly was, they were anti-religion. It wasn't just.
Yes,
And
yes.
so they clearly, wouldn't you say that the communist revolution was a religious, by using the same logic, a religious movement?
Didn't have votes.
Exactly. The problem is that we would need evidence from voting. The Bolsheviks are called Bolsheviks because they're not Mensheviks. Mensheviks are the ones that get a lot of support. Bolsheviks are the ones that get little support. I think Russia is a very religious country at this point. I'd be very surprised if we actually had evidence on lack of religion that's even possible to document, and that this would map really into support for the Bolsheviki. It's a small elite movement. This is what they set themselves up to be. These guys are all completely anti-religious. It is true what the Nazis say. A significant share of them are Jewish. So they're not really sort of in the Christian space. But connecting this with what the population in those places does, I think, is not going to work empirically. There's no way to do it.
But they got the support of the population, didn't they?
I think that's very debatable. Whether the Bolsheviks ever had significant popular support on any scale, I think is very debatable. There might have been certain moments during the Civil War when they thought this is the least bad option. But communism and the Bolsheviks basically from day one rely on the power of the gun, in my sense. Now, the communist regime becomes very popular in some ways, as much as you can tell in a totalitarian regime with no freedom of expression in the 1930s, probably. And this might have something to do with substituting religion, but it's a very different kettle of fish. I'd love to think more about this, but I'm already sort of stretching what I'm competent to speak on, and Russia, I think, is a bridge too far. Please.
Do you think the rise of Otto von Bismarck must be explained the language of unmet religious needs?
So Russia and Germany in the 19th century are somewhere between a old-style authoritarian and a democratic regime. Right? It's wrong what some people claim about late modernization. There's absolutely no shade of democracy, but Bismarck doesn't have to rule with a parliamentary majority. Some of his appeal, I think, amongst the population, and especially once he's deposed, he becomes a sort of semi-religious figure. I think there's probably overtones of that. But his influence, power, and so forth, while chancellor, I would doubt that that has a strong religious element.